Okay, perfect. Well, everyone, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I'm very happy with the guests we have on. We are joined by Professor Anton Treuer, professor at Bemidji State University of Minnesota. He's the author of several books regarding Indigenous affairs, and he is a member of the Professor, let me you can correct me if I'm about to butcher the name, but you're a member of the Ojibwe people of the United States, right?
That's right.
Oh, I actually pronounced that correct.
You got it.
Oh, perfect. Fantastic. And yes, and we're going to be talking about a criminally overlooked topic, which is the plight of Native Americans, and yeah, and I'm very happy with our guest and actually, Professor, a fan of the show. Somebody on Facebook, when I was asking them if they when I was asking people just randomly on Facebook, does anyone know anyone that's an Indigenous person that's involved in Indigenous affairs that I should invite on the program? And then somebody, part of a left-wing Facebook group I'm part of, recommended you. So thank you very much for gracing me with your presence and taking the time to speak to me.
My pleasure.
All right. So the first question I have for you, Professor, is can you describe just in general what are the current state of affairs regarding Indigenous communities in the U.S.? What are some of the problems that are facing Indigenous communities, and also what are some of the campaigns that you're involved that you're involved with, both in the academic world, in educating people about Native Americans, and then outside when it comes to the the struggle for justice for Native Americans, particularly in the United States?
Yeah, first of all, I think a lot of Americans don't have a good understanding of just how diverse and many different Indigenous experiences are in America. Many people may have seen, for example, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's great TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. If you haven't, I'd recommend it.
Okay.
But in there, among the things that she says is that the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they are incorrect as much as they are incomplete. And we take a narrow single story narrative about what it means to be Black in America or white in America or any fill in the blank. And we get a distorted view. The white experience in America is not just poor, white, rural Appalachia, and it's not just wealthy, Upper East Side in New York. It's all of those things and a whole bunch of other things. And so one of the first things to say is that when people ask about what's going on, what are the issues in Indigenous communities, well, it depends on which one, and it depends on when, and things like that too. There are competing stereotypes about us. One says we're all rich from casinos, and another one says we're all living in squalor on reservations. And of course, neither one is the whole story that you need to know. In America, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. Some are big, like the Navajo Nation with 250,000 people. Ojibwe have 250,000 people in the US and just as many in Canada. And then there are others that are really small and just have hundreds of tribal members. So some, like Sandia Pueblo, are enveloped by the city of Albuquerque in New Mexico, and others are very rural. Half the tribal population lives off reservation. So the Native experience is quite varied. Some of the key topics that a lot of Native people are concerned about include climate change. A huge percentage of endangered habitats and species are actually on Indigenous land throughout the Americas and around the world. And this is a topic that's very significant for a lot of Native people. Some of the Native communities in Alaska are being displaced, every single man, woman, and child already because of climate change migration. We're concerned about it because food control is people control. And so Indigenous food sovereignty is kind of a dimension and thread to the environmental concerns. I think we have more than vestigial remnants of some really different ways of thinking and solving problems, including around that particular issue. Also, connected to that, there are ongoing disputes and discussions about, fossil fuel industry. The Dakota Access Pipeline protest galvanized a lot of attention in the country, but less well known. And still very important for a lot of Indigenous people are the efforts to replace Line 3 across Minnesota and Line 5 throughout the Great Lakes and other pipeline projects and many other environmental related issues. We're concerned with social justice. The assault on people of color is not just a Black experience. It is something that deeply impacts Indigenous people, and it's the racial experience of people in America is very contextual. So the town that I live in, Bemidji, it's located between the 3 largest reservations in the state of Minnesota in terms of geographic size and population. And so about 24% of our town is Native. And, it's probably 72% white and very little of anything else. So, when it comes to police practices, we're 24% of the town. We are 90% of the jail population, 95% of the juvenile justice population. And so when you talk about what are the racial issues with regard to policing in this place, you have to look at the Indigenous experience. Related to that, there are jurisdictional issues related to sovereignty. Tribes don't have jurisdiction over non-tribal members. The sexual assault rates in America are 25%. They are 50% for Native women. And white men can come onto a reservation and prey with impunity. Most crime in America is white on white and black on black, except for crimes of sexual violence directed at Native women. There's legislation designed to deal with that needs constant reauthorization and becomes politicized and gets held up. There are numerous issues we're very concerned with, and a lot of people are deeply engaged in Indigenous language and culture revitalization, which is picking up steam and showing some real success in different areas. It's one of the threads in the tapestry of my life that I spend a lot of my time and energy on. Economic development, substance abuse prevention, education, another really critical topic. So all of those things, they're more than we'll ever get to in a show like this.
and in fact, some of the questions I have prepared are actually going to touch on many of those issues which you've just raised. And that's and actually a very quick follow-up then is you actually mentioned the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, didn't the Biden administration actually cancel the Dakota Access Pipeline, or what is the real story that's going on?
Yeah, there are many different pipeline projects, and they are not all the same. So the Dakota Access Pipeline was a hot issue right during the 2016 election cycle.
Yeah.
And Obama essentially kicked the can down the road and wouldn't take an action on that. The Trump administration came in and they pushed it through. So that pipeline is built and done. The protest community there has, been moved off. There's still ongoing litigation and people are sitting in jail from that event. What you're probably thinking of is with regard to the Keystone Pipeline, which has gone back and forth a number of times as a different project. And so, initially the Obama administration had blocked it, and the Trump administration gave it a green light, and Biden's back to blocking it. So that one has kind of gone on a political pendulum. But there are many other projects kind of parallel to that, and often run by different companies. So that, Energy Transfer Partners is working on the Dakota Access Pipeline. They're a totally different company than Enbridge, which is working on, for example, Line 3.
And that's and this is in Enbridge, funny enough, because I cover a lot of Canadian topics, but isn't funny enough. Enbridge is actually one of a Canadian company, right?
Yes, they're a Canadian company that is operating major pipelines, not just in Canada, but in the United States, and some connect. So like, oil extraction from the tar sands in Alberta being run through pipelines across the international border, across the United States, and they get routed in a number of different ways, for refinement.
Unbelievable. And that's a perfect segue then to and that's a perfect segue then to my question. And like I said, now I follow a lot, Canadian political topics, and I know within the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of awareness in Canada about the plight of Indigenous Aboriginal Canadians, especially regarding the survivors and the descendants of the brutal residential school programs, the '60s scoop scandal, and you mentioned murdered and missing Indigenous women and the sexual assaults that that Indigenous women experience, and and there's been nationwide protests against environmental apartheid, and of course police brutality, which affects a lot of Indigenous Canadians. And so my question I have is, is what will it take for the issues, Indigenous issues, to become a major part of the conversation, and a major part of people's self-awareness of the problems in the U.S. compared to, say, Canada, where I'm not saying that everything's all hunky-dory in Canada, of course, or not, but
Sure.
but amongst the Canadian left, and there seems to be a lot of the plight of Indigenous people is very much in the psyche. It's very much now a daily part of the conversation. When you go to Zoom meetings or even public meetings, there's land acknowledgements of people saying that I'm on the unceded territory of this Indigenous tribe, and I'm just wondering, when do you think in the U.S. we'll get to that level where the plight of Indigenous people is as widely talked about and discussed, like the plight of Black Americans, or the plight of Latinos, whether whether they're an illegal immigrant or someone that's been in the U.S. for however many decades.
Yeah. So I think America has a long way to go. I would agree with your assessment that Canada is further along, although they still have much more distance to cover in terms of, even truth and reconciliation, racial justice, and so forth. But Canada's at least creating some space to even have the conversations. And through the actions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through land acknowledgements, through all these other things, there's at least an elevating consciousness. Granted,
Exactly.
the demography in Canada is a little bit different. So, something like 80% of the Canadian population lives within 50 miles of the US border. And so there are huge sections of Canada that are predominantly Indigenous. And although Canada is a multiracial space, at the same time, the Indigenous experience with regard to racially predictable disparities in everything from suicide rates to education to, police injustice and so forth are inescapable. And I think, the political organization of First Nations, Metis communities, and Inuit peoples in Canada provides a little more effective communication mechanism around some of those issues too. Ultimately, I think America, the issues are, in addition to that, very cultural. To me, and I think maybe a Canadian would not be surprised by this, but an American might be, when somebody messes up, when a dude goes out and like cheats on his wife and wants to reconcile the relationship, dude's got to say sorry. and mean it and be believed. And then, might have whatever percent chance to go reconcile that relationship. But I think there's an understanding that not just for a dude who messes up in that example, but for a nation that is engaged in some sort of historical injustice, similarly, there needs to be an acknowledgement and an effort to at least explore what reconciliation could look like. Here in America, we're not that far along. And I think the culture is less emotionally mature for that kind of conversation. If you read the Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu, he was deeply involved in South Africa's truth and reconciliation effort and won a Nobel Peace Prize and so forth. And he says, look, if there's been an injustice, then you need to tell the story. And you might need to tell that story over and over again. And then you need to name the hurt and say, this was betrayal, genocide, whatever it was. Then you can forgive. Then you can either renew or release the relationship. But America's held up because they don't even want to tell the story. So every time, there's, whether it's from the Black narrative, the Indigenous narrative, the Asian American narrative, someone wants to say, hey, there was injustice here. They say, that's unpatriotic, shut up. And it's very difficult to even tell the story. And somehow it has become internalized to a very strong degree, to the point where if someone wants to say, hey, something bad happened here, it's seen as a personal assault, an accusation of racism, an attack on the patriotism or beauty of the nation. And I think part of it is colonization has been really hard on everybody, and all of us human beings have been touched by colonization. Colonization is taking one culture, language, and religion and using it to obliterate the others. It's about erasure. And America has been so deeply engaged in colonizing throughout the world. Canada has too, other countries have too, but it's been the heart and soul of America's international enterprise, to the point where one of the greatest fears of those who are deeply steeped in the culture of colonization, aka erasure, will be fear of their own erasure. And so many white Americans are terrified about white erasure. And on the one hand, it's almost comical, because even South Africa, after apartheid, with white people being a tiny percentage of the population in South Africa, they still have an all-white national rugby team, and white people still dominate the positions of political, military, and economic power. Like, white power ain't going anywhere. But that's the fear, that as our demography shifts, and our demography is shifting, so we will not have any racial majority group pretty soon and going forward. Already the majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. And so those things are freaking some people out needlessly. And so some of the response has been an effort to preserve a basket of unearned privileges, which have disproportionately gone to white folk. So let's keep the Muslims out. Let's keep those brown people out from south of the border. Let's make it harder for people of color to vote, that kind of stuff. And I think it's really silly, because instead of fighting over, who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed, we should work together and fight oppression.
Exactly.
But America, some of America is not there yet. Some of America is. And I think, in the long arc of history, the voices that want to get there will. But I do think we got a long ways to go. So the cultural roadblocks are part of it. Our gerrymandered political system is part of it. Democracy has been wonderful and beautiful, but at the same time, it is not perfect. We have closer to an oligarchy than a true, citizen represented democracy. All of our senators are millionaires. Tiny percentage of our citizenry is. It's not representative. So there are breakdowns in the whole system and across the board. That said, you can't keep people down forever successfully. There will be either a revolution or a reform. And I'm not advocating a revolution. I don't think they work that well. You know, essentially you have to build a new nation afterwards, and you end up using the same cultural building blocks. So the ideals of the Russian Revolution, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, are good ideals, but they killed all the czars, toppled the czarist administration, and built a brand new hierarchy that was still highly oppressive. I do think we need to have meaningful reform, but if people will embrace meaningful reform, it can help get us there. If they won't, there will be a revolution with all of its good and bad. You know, I think it's that simple.
And if that was to happen, if will it be? Do you think it'll be peaceful, or it'll be quite or a bloody undertaking?
I think it will be the opposite of peaceful. Yeah, I don't see that a revolution working very well. I'm not aware of any that where there are no casualties, you know. But you can see it, those threads emerging on multiple levels. Like, if the police won't be accountable when someone in blue kills somebody and commits a murder, then either that system will be reformed or abolish the police will win. You know, and it sounds crazy because, like, yeah, you want someone to answer the phone when you call 911, you know, right? And so you take a poll, most people are like, abolish the police? No. But, you know, if you build something else, call it something else, you know, and it has built in the accountability expectations. If that becomes easier than reforming the existing structure, you're going to get that one way or another. It's not going to keep going forever. So call it ridiculous. And I'm not even saying like that's what to do. You're like, I really think these things can and should be reformed, but there's so much stiff resistance and entrenched resistance to just doing the right thing and being on the right side of history. It requires some leverage. We've seen it, like, even in something like, you know, Indigenous imagery and names for sports team mascots. Like, the leverage happened because corporations said, we will not sponsor you if you do not change this. And they weren't listening to any of the Native people before that. But once there was, you know, a financial implication that was unavoidable, then you had change. And I think ultimately we're seeing this happen. Like Minneapolis, for example, is at an abolish the police referendum level right now. And the financial implications are profound. And now, finally, after George Floyd and, you know, Castile and all the other people who were killed in Minneapolis alone, and after all of the protest and after everything else, now, finally, the police are saying, okay, we do want to talk about reform. But it took that much to move them to the table. And now, whether it's too little, too late, or enough to actually make meaningful changes, actually remains to be seen. But that's what it will take. You know, the system itself still has high levels of oppression. It is not right that people who look like you or me don't get to live as long, aren't as safe when we are interacting with the police, are denied access to financial opportunity in a different way. You know, so those things are going to change. Like me, shoot, I'm coming for everything my ancestors were denied. And that should not freak out anybody who doesn't look like me, because that means I'm coming for dignity that my ancestors were denied. I'm coming for human rights. If I get more human rights, that doesn't diminish someone else's human rights. If I rise to the same level, you know, if I have comparable access to opportunity, or, you know, I get to live longer, it just means I'm paying taxes longer and a load-bearing citizen longer. It doesn't mean that it takes anything away from anybody else. So, you know, it's short-sighted for those who look at, you know, people of color doing better as like taking something away from everyone else. We're in competition. And these are cultural threads, you know, that individualism, competition, materialism are cultural threads that are, you know, like two edges of the same sword. You get entrepreneurial spirit and drive and ambition, which is awesome. And then you also get screw my neighbor, I'm going to win, and who cares if they don't, you know? And you
Yeah.
get in a place like America, some school districts that get $40,000 per pupil and some that get $4,000 per pupil. And the schools are right next to each other, and we expect the same results out of both. And we say it's the teacher's fault or the fault of the poverty of that community if they don't do better. But we're not funding this equitably. And most people don't give a rip as long as their kids don't go to that loser school. And 90% of our students of color go to schools that are 90% students of color. And those are the schools that are disproportionately less well funded. You know, it's really as simple as paying attention to structural inequities and you know, building a totally different system. And that's around politics, economics, education, and so forth. All of it.
And that's a perfect segue to this third question of mine. Now, you know, you were mentioning how in the U.S. there's you know, there's such a resistance to even acknowledging the epic and infinite number of crimes against humanity that you know, that the settler colonial states inflicted on Native Americans. And I know, you know, in Canada, following, you know, the discovery of thousands of, you know, unmarked graves belonging to you know, children who who went to residential schools, and there have been many calls, not just from Indigenous communities, but from allies of Indigenous people to, you know, boycott Canada Day or replace Canada Day with something much more respectful and inclusive to the entire population of Canada, you know, and Indigenous people. And so I was wondering, you know, do you think, you know, the U.S. will ever get to that level where we cancel the 4th of July, we cancel Thanksgiving Day, cancel Columbus Day, cancel President's Day, or at least if those, you know, and I personally find those awful, you know, disrespectful, you know, racist holidays. But do you think that we can that the U.S. will ever get to the level where even if we don't, you know, cancel, you know, the 4th of July and you know, the 4th of July or President's Day, we'll have, you know, more days which are, you know, which not only, you know, celebrate, you know, Indigenous culture, which, as you say, is actually alive and you know, is actually still there and it's thriving, but also, you know, days where we actually were, but also, you know, holidays where we commemorate, you know, those you know, victims of, you know, white supremacy and colonization.
Yeah, I think you're going to get a little bit of both. So already the ground is shifting under our feet. There are numerous cities in America and numerous states that have actually changed the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. The federal government has not done that. And there are many states that have vowed that they never will. Like, the chances that Alabama's going to do it are not really great really soon, you know? But at the same time, we're seeing that movement. And so 100 years from now, I bet it is Indigenous Peoples Day across the board. You know, and there will be some who hold out to the bitter end. But, you know, I think as our political environment shifts, you know, with each successive generation, I think the expectations are going to be changing. We've seen many, you know, statues of Confederate generals that have come down and been replaced with, you know, other ones. Even countries like Mexico, you know, right in Mexico City, they took down the statue of Columbus and put up a statue of an Indigenous woman. You know, so some of these things are happening. There's tremendous pushback and resistance.
I can imagine, yeah.
And, you know, you actually have, it's interesting, you know, you have two competing public goods that bump up against each other. So one is like actually freedom of speech and expression. And, you know, we should not always try to sanitize every little space, and we should have people free to express themselves, even with the ideas that we disagree with, and maybe especially with the things we disagree with, so that, you know, it's a marker of, you know, emotional and national maturity to hold space for all of our citizenry. At the same time, it's not free, a suppression of freedom of speech to ask the question, what should we spend our public money on? And what icons should we put in the center? Which people and historical events deserve primacy of place? And that's different from, you don't have the right to talk about your heroes, which is how this stuff often gets cast. To me, primacy of place should be given to people, events, movements, and commemorations that are more unifying, that elevate marginalized and often rendered invisible groups, so that we can show, like, the success of our democracy will not be our ability to obliterate all but a dominant culture. It will be our ability to not just tolerate, but respect and hold space for all of the myriad of different cultures and peoples that we have. That would be a success for democracy. Our insistence on having one culture, language, religion dominate at the expense of all others is a recipe for a revolution. That will not succeed long term. And the insistence upon it, even in the years when that insistence is winning, will dehumanize and hurt many, many people and shorten lives and diminish everyone's humanity, no matter what side of it you're on. Think about our men and women in uniform who win their wars and are deeply traumatized in the winning. The violence dehumanizes all of us. So I think we need to think about and frame things a little bit differently. I am seeing movement. I don't see America giving up on the 4th of July anytime soon. I do see some of these things being recast and reframed. And I do see a growing acknowledgement of, marginalized communities, their voices, their heroes. But we have to fight every step of the way. Even the Colorado legislature a couple of years ago, Colorado was one of the states that was home to a really horrible massacre of Indigenous people, the Sand Creek Massacre. And, the Colorado militiamen were like cutting out the genitalia of the women that they killed and using them for hat bands and saddle bows. Gross. They killed so many children. And then the Colonel Shivington said, well, killing children's okay because nits make lice. And all these years after the massacre, as it was put to the Colorado legislature to commemorate the event, and there was a request to say, let's acknowledge that this was an act of genocide, they still couldn't do that. They said, no, we'll call it a tragedy. And so so obvious, and still just couldn't do it. So that's still there. There's still that kind of resistance to getting on the right side of history. I don't think that perspective will win out in all places, in all ways, for all time. It just means that it's a lot slower and harder than it should have to be. But it's really interesting too, if you read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed or something, he'd talk about how there's really never been a case in history where an oppressor class has just decided to liberate all of the oppressed. Whoever was oppressed have had to fight for it. Women's suffrage didn't happen in America because a bunch of dudes were sitting around in the Senate smoking cigars saying, should we give our wives and daughters the right to vote? Sure, sounds like a great idea. It happened because women raised the issue and forced the conversation, and many were beat with batons and paid dearly for their efforts. But eventually, it did prick the consciousness of a nation, and an all-male Senate did vote for women's suffrage. And as people of color and their allies advocate for the humanity of people of color and our rights to longevity and fair treatment under the law and in police practices, eventually it will prick the consciousness of a nation, and we will see change.
A quick follow-up before I get to this question on how do we achieve justice for Native Americans. But a quick follow-up to what you're saying is, because I remember when there was the mass protests, the solidarity protests in response to the murder of George Floyd, and it seems as if in the U.S. it's okay if you tear down statues of Confederates. soldiers, and it's okay to tear down Confederate flags. But it seems as if a lot of the the white left, and some of our our white Marxist comrades in the U.S., when you start to talk about, well, why don't we tear down statues of Abraham Lincoln, because yes, he freed the slaves, but he continued to steal land from Mexico and brutally subjugate Native Americans. And it's okay if you tear down statues of the Confederate flags, because they're the more outwardly white supremacists. But you can't seriously talk about replacing the American flag with something new, and tearing down statues of the founding the founding fathers. And so what's your response to so I'm just curious, what's your response to that, and how would you go about and how would you go about that?
My perspective is we can take down anybody we need to, and we probably will over time. And whoever I think my heroes are right now, 100 years from now, someone might look back and say, what a jerk, should not be at the center of this town square. We should have someone or something else. And I think that my descendants should be empowered to put a different statue there if they need a different statue to unify them or to inspire them. To me, somebody like Abraham Lincoln was a complicated historical figure. He had some horrible ideas about Black people and about slavery. Mm-hmm. And, his action in, with the Emancipation Proclamation was a pivotal moment in American history. And at the same time, yes, as you mentioned, he presided over some of the worst campaigns against Indigenous people. He himself, prior to becoming president, was a captain in the Army, and his unit massacred children and women, during the Black Hawk War. He was a complex person. Now, I do think, regardless of who the statue is at the center of the town square, or what we name the elementary school or the road, we can switch those things from Lincoln to something else. I still think we should study him. I think we should study Hitler, and I don't really think we should name anything after him. We should read Mein Kampf, and that doesn't mean that should be, the text that we hold at the center of our society. So we need to learn about these figures of history, and changing the statue or the road name or the school name does not mean erasing them from history. It means recalibrating our consciousness towards something else as our unifying and inspiring icons. That doesn't mean not studying about them or learning about them. And to me, Abraham Lincoln, honestly, he did all kinds of horrible stuff, and he did all kinds of beautiful stuff. He's one of the last presidents who actually wrote his own speeches. He wrote a couple of the best speeches a US president has ever written. I think he was brilliant. I'd love to have a conversation with him. I would not like to have him sculpt the policy that would deeply affect my people. It's complex, and I think it's okay to have a nuanced understanding of those things. Frankly, all the members of my family, love them deeply, see their flaws completely, happy to be in relationship with them. And it's okay to have a complex, nuanced understanding of them, and it doesn't have to diminish our love. And I feel like that about America. I love it. And it's been horrible, and it's been oppressive. It's also been liberating. Is America, built on a constitution that was created to enable human rights and freedom, and was adaptable so that we could actually expand the polity to include women and people of color? Or is America's Constitution something that was created so that we could enable the institution of slavery with all this power to states' rights and so little at the federal level? And a Second Amendment that was not about freedom at all, but was about enabling slave patrols to police Black bodies. Well, which truth is it? And the truth is, it's both. It's both in the same place. And here too, we can't have a single story narrative about what is America. we've done some amazing, wonderful, beautiful, inspiring things, and we've done all kinds of horrible things. And right now we are in the midst of doing some really horrible things, with our army right now. And at the same time, we are in the midst of, a clunky, uncomfortable, but beautiful transformation. They're both happening at the same time.
And that's an interesting segue to this question, because now you were talking about, sorry, you were talking about earlier about revolution and reforms. So I'm curious, where do you, where do you stand when it comes to, police brutality and stuff like that, and the plight of Native Americans? And where do you stand on the issue of abolish the police or reform the police? I'm curious your position on that, given that it's not widely known, but Indigenous Americans, as you mentioned, are overrepresented in terms of not only, I think, jailed or their movements constantly policed by social services, but also a lot of police murders, police brutality are the victims. A lot of the primary victims are Native Americans. So where do you stand on the so where do you stand on the whole abolish the police, or are you more of a reform the police by abolishing the drug by stopping the drug wars, closing that loophole in the 13th Amendment, and and even changing that, and of course repealing some of the grotesque Dickensian laws that that the Clinton administration passed, like the Clinton crime bill and the Clinton welfare reform bill. So where do you so where are you on that debate for social justice?
What I would like to see happen is I would like to see really deep, comprehensive, and meaningful reform take place. I'm not holding my breath that will be possible without some sort of major upheaval to the system. But to me, the kinds of things that would make a difference, you mentioned, for example, the Clinton crime bill, for example, and really even before that, previous legislation had characterized like something like cocaine. Crack cocaine was punished much more severely than powder cocaine. And powder cocaine was the drug of choice for white people. And crack cocaine at the time in the 1980s was the drug of choice in communities of color. And so it got you this disproportionate, incarceration rates and things like that. And so I think the whole legal code is full of racially leveraged oppression. And there's also a lot of discretion within law enforcement. For example, there are laws in every state that say jaywalking is illegal. And then most of the time, those laws are not enforced. Even in my town, the police officers jaywalk routinely from the police office to the cafe right kind of across the road. They don't go up to the corner and then cross, But if you looked at a data set, who actually gets charged with jaywalking and ends up paying a fee or a fine for that? And it's overwhelmingly people of color. So, and this is the problem in law enforcement. Police officers have a lot of discretion to decide who to pull over, who to check, where to police. And so we don't do stop and frisk in the college dorms. Otherwise, they'd be finding a dime bag in every other one of them. And the newspaper headlines would be about the epidemic of white college kids using drugs. But they don't police there. They do police heavily and scrutinize heavily in communities of color. And so all of this,
Indigenous people without exception, right?
Right. And so, and the data shows us, for the same sort of situations, people of color are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted, more likely to do, more of their sentence, and more likely to be denied parole, all the way across the board. So, the system is fundamentally, like, systemically oppressive. And to really get in front of that, we need to overhaul the entire criminal code. And something like jaywalking, to me, that should not even be a crime. It removes a lever. Also, like the whole criminal and policing code lists a huge list of stuff that are primary offenses. So like if you see something dangling from the mirror in someone's car, that's enough. Like you have the right to pull them over, and then, in which police routinely do, and then you can pull them over for the thing dangling on their mirror, and then you can say pop the trunk, and you can just start with discretion deciding who you're going to pull over and look for drugs or whatever. And so like just, you know, in Minneapolis after George Floyd, the Wright killing was a guy who had something hanging on his mirror, got pulled over, got in a panic and got shot, you know? And so here too, you know, there's so many things like that. To me, you could recode the entire criminal code. Someone has an obstruction hanging on their mirror, you know, there's whatever going on, then you record their license plate and you send a warning to their address of record. And if it happens a second time, you send a fine to their address of record, but you remove the authority of the police to pull them over, and you have much fewer problems, you know? So ultimately, I think the whole code needs to be recalibrated that way. Within law enforcement, if there is an issue of police brutality right now, you report that to the police who just brutalized you.
Yeah.
Right. That's not effective. People are discouraged from doing that. There's no true accountability. So what you need to do is have an external agency. And some cities and municipalities are doing that, where there's an external agency you report to, they externally evaluate, they you know, have more or less authority to actually do something to discipline or provide accountability within law enforcement. Emerging just recently, you know, we've seen convictions, some high-level convictions of people who've killed people while wearing a blue uniform. So I think we need more of that. If we can engineer that, those reforms would move us in the direction of a more equitable application of justice. So I support those reforms. If, however, you know, those reforms do not materialize, or do not materialize with the structure of policing the way that we have it, then we have to consider the other options. And frankly, with almost no exceptions, maybe there are a few, the law enforcement community wants more things that will allow them to pull somebody over, not less.
Exactly.
They do not embrace these kinds of changes to the criminal code. They resist having an external agency that can hold their officers accountable. And so the law enforcement community is not leading us in the right direction. They are resisting efforts to lead us in the right direction, for the most part. So the law enforcement community is beholden to, you know, the elected officials who fund them. And in many cases, you know, the sheriffs and so forth are elected officials too. And so, you know, we need to put in positions of power those who will engineer this kind of change. And I'm not saying this out of any disrespect for any kind of law enforcement. Some of my greatest friends are law enforcement officials. I actively work with our, you know, courageous conversations about race and our regional truth and reconciliation, believe in community policing. Our chief of police in my city is actually involved in this sort of stuff.
I was just about to ask you whether you were in
Right.
favor of,
and so,
of community
we can
control
do that.
police.
We can do that. But frankly, if the politicians and the law enforcement community will consistently resist that and it won't happen, then abolish is going to win. And you'll see what's happening in Minneapolis right now, where they're like gut the entire you know, budget, and you can organize something else in an agency where no one is authorized to use, you know, guns. You know, so you got like British bobbies who respond to 911 calls, but you're not going to call them police, and they're not going to be authorized with use of force the way police are, and they're going to do something like that. So if that seems unacceptable, then you have to embrace the reforms I was just talking about.
Interesting. And what, and you know, my two last questions then for you, because I know we're, oh my gosh, we actually already ran out of time. So then, okay. So then two last questions, and then just you can answer however briefly, however brief you want to. Is do you what do you think it'll take to build a better America where Indigenous relations with the rest of the country are at the level of a country like New Zealand, where, and again, everything's not all hunky dory, but there seems to be much better race relations between white New Zealanders and the Maori people. So what do you think it'll take for the U.S. to get to that level, as well as the level of Canada, just in terms of awareness and having more of a compassion and of a compassionate response?
Yeah, I mean, it's apples to oranges comparisons in many ways. New Zealand actually has a treaty that has very strong sovereignty language that governs the entire country. And so, it enables the Maori communities to have a different kind of leverage with regard to seeking racial justice. And honestly, the law enforcement, physical health and educational data sets in New Zealand show that there's a lot of room to grow there too, and a lot of work needs to be done, in spite of the fact that they actually have this additional kind of leverage. I do think that, the political climate is maybe slightly more progressive in a place like New Zealand, and maybe a little more so in a place like Canada, although it's a pendulum that has pressures that push back and forth in both places. I think in the United States, you have that same dynamic with, political pendulums, but there's a broader cultural transformation that is underway, but is not as far along. And I think, progress doesn't happen in, always in incremental phases. It's sometimes there's a big spurt. And I think we're in the midst of the kind of upheaval that may produce that. Ironically,
in the U.S., when it comes to
the US, yeah. So ironically, the whole Trump experience, for example, which seemed like a big pushback towards, white supremacy and make America 1950 again kind of stuff, that it doesn't feel like it at the time, but it's a prep up for a swing to a much more progressive phase in America's social and political transformation. And I do think we are seeing that start to pop through. Interestingly, with that 2016 election, and that's a whole nother conversation, but I like the Van Jones analysis where he said we weren't bipolar in terms of our politics, we were quadrupolar. And meaning, you had progressive and conservative, and you also had, Democrat, Republican, and ultimately the old school politicians, the Jeb Bush Republican and the Hillary Clinton Democrat, they lost. And the progressive, Bernie Sanders and the very different Donald Trump, they won. And America wanted to see not old school entrenched, but change. They're wildly competing in different ideas about what the change could or should be. But ultimately, that bubbling is still there. In many ways, Biden he's an old schooler. He's a little more in the Hillary Clinton type of camp, and a different animal than even some of the other politicians, from the Democratic Party. To me, that wasn't like our salvation. It was let's stop the bleeding, and recover and breathe in and out. But I think those progressive candidates, not those particular ones necessarily, are going to have more traction. Someone who wants to do something different, like, AOC, or somebody like that.
And then my very last question, because we're out of time, is I noticed you mentioned the Russian Revolution, and I just want your thoughts on this, which is I had Jay Watts of the Communist Party of Canada on my program twice before, and when I asked him, how would if you guys were to ever get into power, how would you achieve justice and address the grievances of First Nations, Inuit, and Metis people of Canada. And one of the and he said that one of the things that that the Communist Party advocates is actually giving nationhood back to the First Nations people. So if if whatever community wanted to actually secede from the Canadian Federation, the Communist Party of Canada would advocate that and would respect that, which I think is a very radical, self-determination. Would you be in would you be in favor of that if that was a solution for Native Americans? Or
so first of all, I certainly support tribal sovereignty. The status of tribes in the United States is a little different than in Canada. In Canada, it's been governed by major federal political processes. In America, it's considered a little more inherent, and it comes through treaty-based nation-to-nation relationships. And in the United States, one of the direct impacts of that is that state legal systems don't apply to reservations. So if the state law says gaming and gambling is illegal, tribes can still create a casino because they're not beholden to state legal statutes. So it gives a different set of levers for tribes in the United States, which is different from what goes on in Canada. And frankly, nobody knows better than Native people what's best for Native people. So I certainly support tribal sovereignty. I'd need a little more information to know if he's actually talking about seceding from Canada or nations within a nation kind of talk. They're kind of two different.
No, I think that's actually what the advocate is actually. If whatever tribal community wants to actually secede from Canada and have basically true nationhood restored. Would you advocate that in the U.S. or?
Well, yeah, I think nobody's going to know better.
Or it just depends on the specific tribe. If or it would depend on the specific tribe.
It's a lofty ideal, and the potential is there. I think it's not as practical because the native nations within the United States, there's just so much to consider. Like the Dakota, have several different reservations. It used to encompass 5 whole U.S. states. There are lots of white people living on reservations. There are a lot of issues to sort out. And so that would be a whole nother what if kind of conversation, with regard to how we structure our politics. In a capitalist democratic society, you have a lot of power that goes to corporations who essentially own and control the politicians. In a communist society where you nationalize most of the business and stuff like that, you have a lot of power that goes to the politicians who control the nationalized businesses. And you still have lots of power with very few people. And I think both have a lot of vulnerability with regard to how you actually manifest governing a nation, a complex and diverse nation. And for the most part, I believe in power to the people and having, political decision-making and financial ownership more diffused and spread out into multiple different smaller groups where we actually have the ability to exercise genuine influence and control over decisions that affect our lives as much as is practically possible in a large and diverse nation. So some of the socialist programs that provide a social safety net, and redistribute a certain measure of, economic well-being make a lot of sense to me. Things, political efforts that diffuse and spread out power making and decision making to local and state or provincial levels tend to be a little more responsive to the constituencies that they serve. Those to me are directions that I would support, wholeheartedly in a political sense. But everything has to be, evaluated on its own merits, and these issues are really complex. So it's all worth thinking and talking about, and I think everything should be on the table. Democracy is a new way of structuring a government, and it has certain benefits and works pretty well the more homogenous a society is. But all of the systems work really well when you have 25,000 people or less in your country, and start having problems when you get beyond that.
Well, Mr. Treuer, I kept you a bit over time, and I think that's probably a good place to close. So
Okay.
I hope so. I hope to have you back on in the future, because there's so much more that we that I would love to discuss with you. But I'll have to bet we'll definitely arrange. So we were joined on this. We'll definitely arrange that. So we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Professor Anton Treuer of Bemidji State University of Minnesota. He's the author of several books. I'll make sure to link to your webpage for people to get in touch. So, Mr. Treuer, thank you so much, and have a very great weekend.
Thank you. You too.